We're very fortunate today to have a presentation by Dr. David Zimmerman based on his book, Britain's Shield. There's the book. And the subtitle is Radar and the Defeat of the Luftwaffe, and it focuses in on the Battle of Britain. Now, today's presentation is part 2, entitled The Failure to Stop the Nighttime Blitz. Now, Dr. Zimmerman gave us part 1 back in 2019, which focused in on the daylight air defenses during the Battle of Britain, and it was entitled Information and the Air Defense Revolution, 1918 to 1940. Now, I assume everyone in the audience has read David's bio in the speaker's advert that I've sent out to all the members, so I won't go into those details again, but just to remind you, David is Professor of Military History at the University of Victoria and is a leading expert on Second World War, naval, and technological history. David is also an honorary member of RUSI-VI, as well as the OPI for our military and instructor for our military oral history program course, which is run every year at the University of Victoria. Now, today's presentation covers the lesser known story of the failure to stop the German night bombing campaign over Britain in the autumn of 1940 and into the spring of 1941. Now, David covered the impact of radar and the organization of daylight air defense, known collectively as the Dowding System, during the Battle of Britain in part 1 of Britain's Shield, which I mentioned he did in 2019. David will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and I will pose about half a dozen general questions to him, followed by any questions from you, the audience. Please write your questions on the Zoom chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen, and also please make them brief. We end no later than 2:30 p.m. And as usual, we are recording this talk, which will be posted to our RUSI-VI website as soon as possible, within a couple of days, up to a week maximum. So thank you, Dr. Zimmerman, for taking the time to talk to us today. And if you're ready to go, please begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really sorry we're not at the Armory, enjoying a nice lunch, and then I would try to keep you awake after that with my talk. In fact, the first talk that I gave on this subject on the daytime air defenses, I gave just prior to the beginning of the COVID lockdowns. And I guess it would have everyone's hope that I would sort of initiate the first live talk, but alas, here we are in our 4th wave of COVID. And although I'm going back to live teaching on Thursday at the university with some trepidation, even though I'm double vaccinated, I am here to talk to you through the magic of Zoom, something I've become a bit of an expert on in the last year and a half or so. It's always a great pleasure to talk to RUSI Vancouver Island, not the least of which is because of the support the military or Veterans Oral History Program received from the organization. We'll be running the class again. And we have, through the auspices of this class, we link students and veterans together, veterans giving their life story to the students then write essays based on these oral histories, and then the oral histories themselves are hosted on the website of the program at the UVic Library Special Collections. So I'm very pleased to be here today. So let's get going on the subject of today's talk. And I'll just do a quick share screen. Just a second here. How's that? Can everyone see that? Excellent. So the subject of today's talk is entitled The Failure to Stop the Nighttime Blitz. And let me just read you from the Operations Record Book of Fighter Command for the 22nd of December, 1940, which records, on this night, 320 enemy aircraft operating, 250 on Liverpool, 36 fighters patrolled that night, making not one single interception and one Blenheim night fighter crashed. The result, of course, for Liverpool, you can see below in the picture. And this was not an untypical, in fact, it was a typical result from the efforts of the RAF's night fighter force to stop German bombers during their nighttime attacks on British urban centers. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, who was Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, he, of course, was the victor of the daytime battle, really the crucial battles, because these are the battles that saved Britain from a potential German invasion. And he, therefore, was really the first victorious military leader over the Germans during the Second World War in terms of a major campaign. And yet, he was sacked from his post on the 13th of November, 1940 by the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He was given, I'd say, a lateral punt out of his operational command and given a primarily ceremonial post in the United States. And thus the victor of the Battle of Britain ended his time in command of Fighter Command in this inglorious fashion, being dismissed while the battle at night was still being waged. Now, most accounts written at the time or immediately after discuss that Dowding's dismissal was the result of fights within the senior command of the Royal Air Force. And these disputes centered on the so-called Big Wing controversy. This was the controversy which saw Lee Mallory, the Air Vice Marshal in charge of Number 12 Group, accuse Dowding and his most important operational commander, Air Vice Marshal Park, of having actually not used the correct tactics to defeat the Germans during the daytime attacks, even though, of course, Dowding's system had been successful. And Lee Mallory advocated for a big wing to intercept German formations, to assemble a force of at least 4 to 8 squadrons of aircraft to overwhelm German defenders, instead of Dowding's system, which sent in 1, 2, or at most 3 squadrons to intercept even the largest German raids. Now, this dismissal has been mostly accepted that this was the reason why he was dismissed. And certainly Dowding was singularly unpopular with other senior Air Force commanders. He was arrogant, he was obstinate, he refused to take any suggestions or criticisms of the way his command was operating, and he only very begrudgingly accepted changes to the daytime system that were forced upon him in the months leading up to the Battle of Britain beginning. However, the daytime debate was not the reason why he was dismissed. And this was pointed out first by a historian by the name of John Ray in his book, The Nighttime Blitz, which appeared in 1996, and then was expanded upon by myself in my book, Britain's Shield, which, by the way, you can still get through a Kindle, through Amazon, if you're interested. And I really went into the detail to show absolutely without any doubt that Dowding's dismissal was caused by the complete failure of his command to do any serious damage to the German night raiders operating almost freely in the skies over Great Britain in the late autumn of 1940. Now, why had this failure occurred? I mean, the tremendous successes of the daytime defenses, you would think that the night defenses would at least have had some chance. But the fact of the matter was that night fighting was a much more complicated technological issue for the RAF to resolve. And the RAF was far less prepared at the beginning of the war to fight a campaign against night bombers. There were no night fighters in the RAS inventory prior to the war. There had been a series of pre-war air exercises, particularly in the period prior to 1935, which seemed to show that day fighters could intercept night bombers or bombers operating at night with relative ease. However, the problem with these air exercises is as a result of safety concerns, the bombers had to operate with their navigation lights on. And as one report of these exercises pointed out, the fighters could actually see the bombers at night with their lights on at a greater range than they could normally see them during the day. So all of the efforts for pre-war exercises didn't matter. It was irrelevant to the reality of aircraft operating at night, but also aircraft operating at much higher speeds, much greater elevation, much more difficult for the night defenses to come to grips with. Now, if it wasn't going to be aircraft, the only other means of defense were anti-aircraft guns. And anti-aircraft guns, although there were many of them, really were of limited value. They used mechanical predictors and timed fuses, which made it incredibly difficult for a gun, even during the day, to hit a high, fast-flying aircraft. Time fuses meant you had to basically guess, as you were firing, how long would the shell need to travel to its target and hopefully explode anywhere near it. And this was true for almost all anti-aircraft defenses prior to the introduction of radar guidance control and proximity fuses. And proximity fuses really only came into widespread service in 1944. And the fact of the matter is that it took you thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft artillery to bring down a single aircraft. During the Blitz, the anti-aircraft guns were to be guided by searchlights, but they in turn had to be guided to an aircraft, and except for a very few early models of gun control radar sets, which weren't particularly good, the only devices that they actually had for detecting aircraft was this device sort of here. And this is an acoustical listening device. This is the scientist who invented this device in the 1930s. And basically it's two sets of stethoscopes, one giving you the direction, one giving you the elevation. The sound goes through this tube here into the guy's ears. He listens in and he directs the aircraft. But if there's more than one aircraft operating, these systems don't work very well. So the night defenses that existed in 1939 were virtually nil. And while radar invention made air defenses possible during the day, night defenses involved no less than 3 separate radar systems. First of all, you had to have, like in day, the early warning radars, the chain home and chain home low radar. And this is a chain home radar station here. But then you needed 2 other radar sets that didn't exist, or at least didn't exist in an effective fashion when the war started. This was the ground control interception radar, or GCI, which allowed ground radar stations to guide night fighters much more accurately than the early warning radars until they were within 3 or 4 miles of their target. And then the third type of radar was airborne interception radar. This was a radar actually mounted on a night fighter, which would take over where GCI left off and guide the pilot as close to the enemy bomber as possible, close enough so that the pilot could actually visually identify the aircraft and destroy it. And so by the time the Battle of Britain started, however, only chain home and chain home low existed. Neither GCI or AI in an effective fashion were yet available. This, by the way, here, this is the sort of scope reading you get from the typical radar of the period. This is an A scope reading of an approaching aircraft, but it gave you a sort of a flat reading, and you then had to sort of adjust up on the antennas here, various different switches in order to determine the maximum signal, which you then had to send through a mechanical computer to get both direction and elevation. They weren't terribly accurate in either regards. So let me switch over and let me talk a little bit about how night interception worked, or at least was supposed to work when this system became fully operational. As I've already mentioned, and I'm going to use two pictures here. They're not necessarily to scale. This is a Bristol Blenheim, the standard night fighter of 1940. And this is a Junkers 88, probably one of the better of the medium bombers Germany used against Great Britain during both the day and nighttime Blitz. So to begin with, CH radar would provide early warning of approaching raids from 60 to 80 miles from the coast. And this would allow night fighters to be scrambled. It was either a Blenheim or, by late 1940, increasingly the far more effective Bristol Beaufighter or Beaufighter, depending on your pronunciation, are scrambled. Once that was achieved, GCI would take over, guiding a fighter to a position above and behind the bomber. The fighter is guided by ground, and as I mentioned, between 3 to 4 miles from the target. At that point, it was hoped AI radar in the aircraft would detect the bomber and would guide the plane most of the rest of the way till its target. The fighter would then begin to dive towards the bomber, picking up speed. This was particularly important for the Blenheim, which was actually slower than some of the German bombers in level flight, including the Junkers 88. There were a lot of variables here. It depended on how much fuel and bomb load the aircraft were carrying. But particularly against the Junkers 88, the Blenheim was actually slower at 15,000 feet, which causes all sorts of problems for a fighter. So they had to dive down, build up speed gradually as they approached the target. The fighter then closes on the bomber and gets below it and then begins to zoom up towards the fighter aircraft. The bomber aircraft. And then when it got to within 500 feet, it was hoped, or 250 ideally on a dark night, the pilot would take over, identifying the bomber visually, at which point the AI would lose its signal to the fighter. If the radar could do its work and get to the pilot to around 250 feet on a dark night, 500 feet on a moonlit night, the pilot would then take over. Visual identification of a target was always required before opening fire. In large measure, this is because many RAF planes in 1940-41 still did not have IFF, or identify friend or foe devices, which would send a responder ping back to a radar set saying, hey, I'm a friendly aircraft, don't shoot me down. So they had to visually identify the aircraft, and of course, they then had to aim their guns. And the only way to do that was using the automatic but still visually controlled gun sight, and that was the responsibility of the pilot. So that's how a successful interception would be achieved. And if this could all be done, if everything worked properly, this, they hope, would be the result. And here's a Junker 88 being shot down. Of course, this is gun camera footage. It's during the day because there aren't no night gun camera footage of any use. But this is what it was hoped would happen. This was the end result, the destruction of the German night bomber. So why weren't the night defenses ready in September 1940 when the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, switched over and started to bomb British cities at night? Because their attempts to bomb British cities during the day, which had begun when they had switched their targeting in September 1939, had been disastrous for the Germans. The day defenses were easily able to handle the German daytime attacks. So the question was, therefore, why weren't the night defenses ready? And part of that comes down to, in fact, failures within the British radar program. British radar development begins in 1935. It is invented, and I put that into quotes because it's invented by the British radio scientist Robert Watson Watt in 1935. But in fact, radar was invented in other countries before Great Britain invents it and afterwards. In fact, I think in the 1930s, at least 6 different countries invent radar And because it's a secret technology, they all have their own claims. Britain was certainly not the first. The Americans and Germans had invented radar several years before the British. But Watson-Watt invents radar, and the British are first to apply it practically to their air defenses, which of course resulted in the chain home system so effective during the day. Now, by the late 1930s, working at the Radar Research Center that Watson-Watt established at a place called Bawdsey Manor on the Sussex coast in Britain, a group of radar scientists that Watson-Watt had hired began to work on small radar sets that could fit onto aircraft. And the man responsible for this was this man here. This is E.G. Taffy Bowen. And Bowen was one of the first young scientists recruited by Watson-Watt in 1935. And he took over the development of these very small radar sets, which Watson-Watt realized almost as soon as he had invented radar would be necessary in a future war. Now, at the beginning of the conflict, only a prototype of the first AI, the Mark I, was ready for testing. And in fact, Bowen gave a remarkable test to Dowding, Air Marshal Dowding, in July 1939. They took off together with a pilot crammed into the back of a ferry battle light bomber. This is the plane that performed so disastrously during the Battle of France in the spring of 1940. And this demonstration, the pilot obviously controlling the aircraft, but Bowen sat just behind the radar, and literally crammed in next behind him was Dowding. And the two men, after the plane took off, took a black sheet and put it over their heads so they couldn't see what was going on outside. Meanwhile, a target aircraft moved in to position a few miles away from their aircraft. And according to Bowen's account, and this is really interesting, Bowen gives an account in his memoirs, which were published in the 1980s, where he claims the following took place. He said, basically, I guided the pilot, giving him instructions to get as close to the aircraft as possible. When I got to the point, the radar lost signal, which meant it was too close. It was as close as it could get to the target aircraft. I flew off the sheet over our heads, and Dowding looked around for the aircraft. He said, "Where is it? Where is it?" And Bowen sheepishly says he pointed upwards, and directly above them, about 400 feet above them, was the target aircraft. Dowding panicked at that point, said, "We're too close, by God. Tell the pilot to veer off, to dive away." And thus Bowen says, AI radar proved itself. The problem is that this account is almost certainly a falsehood, because I actually have Dowding's official report of the test. And what he said happened was, when I took the hood off and I looked around for the target aircraft, it was more than 1,000 feet away. And I told Bowen in no uncertain terms that that was too far away for a pilot to be able to visually identify an aircraft at night. It wouldn't be able to see it when the radar lost contact. It wasn't good enough. And according to Dowding's account, written at the time, they landed, and then Dowding continued on his tour of Bawdsey. And late in the day, when Dowding was having drinks with the senior people at Bawdsey, talking about his visit and what he'd seen, Bowen burst into the room and said, "Air Marshal, I worked on the set all day. I've got it down so it can detect an aircraft at about 500 feet. Hopefully this is good enough." And Dowding, without questioning Bowen's honestly, said, "That's fantastic. I order you to immediately hand build 21 units. You're to stop all research, you're to stop all development, you're to stop all improvements to the set. And I want your scientists to build me a first generation group so I can equip the squadron." Now, when the war began, there was only one AI equipped aircraft in the entire RAF. This was the prototype set, which was flown over London in case the Germans should attack when the war began. And the radar operator was one of Bowen's scientists. There was no one in the RAF who even knew how to operate the set. Now, the problem, however, got quite a bit worse, because what happened then was September 1939, due to the incompetence of this man, Robert Watson Watt, all British radar research collapsed for the first 6 months of the Second World War. Now, the background of this is that Watson Watt had been promoted upstairs at his own insistence away from BODSI, where he was an effective research scientist, to become the manager of all radar development, logistics, manufacturing, etc., for the Air Ministry. And Robert Watson Watt, he got a promotion, he got a pay raise, he was very happy, but of course he's a classic example of the Peter principle in operation, because he was promoted to his level of incompetence. And to demonstrate his incredible incompetence in managing the radar program, it had been discussed prior to the war that BODSI Manor, right on the Suffolk coast, in fact, they built one of the first chain home stations on BODSI Manor property on a cliff. And at the bottom of the cliff was a beach, and that was the ocean. And the fear was that the Germans might get wind of this and send a commando raid, and they might seize some radar equipment or documents, or even kidnap some scientists. So the decision was made prior to the war to move British radar development away from such a vulnerable location. Now, the man in charge of BODSI at the time, a civil servant scientist by the name of A.P. Rowe, said to Watson Watt, well, we should make the move now, or we can do it in an orderly fashion. Watson Watt said, don't worry, I have it all in hand. We'll have a very nice orderly move when war starts, but keep on going right now. I don't want to interrupt things. So on the first day of the war, there's a phone call from Robert Watson Watt to Rowe at BODSI and said, right, time for you to move. Okay, where are we going? Load up all the trucks you have, get everybody on board, and I want you to drive north to Dundee, Scotland. You know, it's almost as far away as you can get in the British Isles. Well, they just took their orders and they drove up north. And Watson Watt told them, you're going to go to the college there and you're going to set up your radar research facility. It's all arranged. Well, they arrived first thing the next morning. No one there. An hour later, the principal of the college arrived. He said to all these disheveled looking people, who are you and what are your trucks doing here? And they said, well, we're here to set up our radar research laboratory. It's all been arranged with Robert Watson Watt and you. And the principal of the college looked at them and said, no, it hasn't. I remember having lunch with Robert Watson Watt. He's an alumnus. I remember discussing with him. He mentioned maybe we could accommodate some scientists if war started. And I said, well, it's possible, but send me the details. And he never got back to me. The college year is about to start and we're full. We have no spare room. Finally, there was a series of protracted phone calls between London and Dundee, and the principal agreed to give the radar researchers one laboratory. Most of their equipment remained outside in the open in the north of Scotland, not a good place for things to be because there wasn't enough room to cram them into this one laboratory. Now, Bowen's AI team was even worse. They needed an airfield in order to fit radar into aircraft. Well, the nearest airfield was a small grass strip at Perth, 22 miles away from Dundee. Again, Watson Watt told them, go there. All the arrangements had been made. They arrived there. They found the owner of the airfield, the guy who ran a flying school, said, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. After, again, furious phone calls between Perth and London, it was agreed by the owner of the training school that the Bowen's team could have one small unheated hangar. And they then began to try to recoup. They had just started to assemble these first AI sets. And here they were mostly doing it out in the open in the growing gloom of a Scottish late fall, early winter. And the scientists then realized they actually had no idea of how to turn a prototype into a device that could be mass produced. They had no blueprints or specifications. And worst of all, only the sketchiest idea of how to fit a radar into an airplane, how to make it work. They had all sorts of component parts coming from various manufacturers. But Watson Watt had never told the manufacturers or given them details of how the parts were going to go together with each other. So many of the parts didn't actually fit or work together. The only thing that saved them eventually was that they got a group of aircraft fitters from the Royal Aircraft Establishment. 4 men came up from Farnborough to Perth to help out. They were considered to be pearls without price, the only people that actually had any understanding of how to fit something like a radar set into an aircraft. But the early attempts to get this radar to work was a disaster. 6 of the 12 airborne tests radar caught fire, if you can imagine. And as this began inter-squadron service in late 1939, these early AI were met with tremendous and deserved skepticism by night fighter crews. In a great memoir, one of the great memoirs of the Second World War, Night Fighter, by one of Britain's most successful air aces, Wing Commander J.R.D. Braham, he wrote in his memoirs this about receiving the first AI sets into his Blenheim squadron. For some time, we had heard of work being done by our scientists to develop an airborne radar known as AI. One day I received a few of these aircraft. The briefing on the equipment was short, and we had few people who knew anything about it. These aircrafts had the turrets removed, and now our gunners were to be trained or to train themselves on how to work the magic gear located in the bowels of an old Blenheim. The early equipment was very temperamental. This, coupled with the lack of training of the gunners, and I'm afraid the skepticism of the pilots, didn't give the AI equipment much of a chance. Usually after takeoff on a night sortie, the pilot would be told that the AI was unserviceable. There would be a sigh of relief, and the gunner would clamber forward to sit beside the pilot and add another pair of eyes to the business of searching the skies. So AI, in its initial form, simply didn't work. When assessing and looking back at the situation from early 1940, Air Vice Marshal A.W. Tedder, who was then the Director General of Research and Development, he assessed the root cause of the difficulties was the inevitable practice of going straight into large-scale production of equipment, which was really still in the research stage. However, a large part of the problem was the failure of the BODSI scientists to get private manufacturers involved in this process. No private firms were allowed to see full designs, and they only could manufacture individual components. And to make matters even worse, when AI Mark I, or the production version Mark II, got into the air, even when it remained operational, which often wasn't the case, it simply didn't work. In fact, by the 12th of December 1939, Fighter Command records the use of AI flights at 2 of the major night fighter bases, Martleston and Manston, were discontinued. The equipment was unsatisfactory. All of the equipment, whether it be the hand-built Mark I's, the production Mark II, or the slightly improved Mark III, designed by the BODSI scientists, failed. They were poor performers. They had a minimum range that was only 1,000 feet, far too long a range for a pilot to make visual identification. And because of ground clutter, the radar could only operate at above 10,000 feet. AI operators as well were unable to determine if the signal was coming from ahead or behind the fighter, and if the target was not directly ahead or behind, if it was to the right or the left. Finally, after realizing the BODSI team didn't have a clue how to make this system work, Bowen's team was effectively shut down. And in July 1940, private industry was finally asked to redesign AI from the ground up. And the company that was most successful at doing that was EMI, or Electric Musical Instruments Limited, which was a pioneer in early television technology. And they redesigned completely AI and introduced the Mark IV, the first relatively successful AI radar. It could track targets from 19,000 feet down to between 400 to 500 feet. Not perfect, but far better than any of the earlier versions of AI. And small numbers of the Mark IV began to enter service in October 1940. And this was what the radar screen that an operator would see on the Mark IV. There are two cathode ray tubes. The one on the left indicates the elevation of the target, and the one on the right indicates the height of the target. And the distance from here to here gave you the distance of the target, and you could tell if it was directly ahead or behind or above, as if the two bars here on each side of the beam were equal. So this is actually a radar display of a target directly ahead of the night fighter. So AI began to enter service, Mark IV, in small numbers at the end of 1940. But what about the third component of the system, GCI? It was based on the chain home low radar, which in turn was derived from radar built by the Army. And this built for the Army by a radar group for gun control. GCI antenna had to rotate in order to keep track of targets. It required as well a new type of display screen so a ground controller could easily direct the fighter to the target. This new type of display screen, which is really what we associate with modern radar, was called Planned Position Indicator, or PPI. And the prototype of the first PPI was only tested in May 1940. And the first full prototype GCI set was only ready for testing in September 1940, just as the night blitz began. And here's the antenna of an early GCI set. And this is, of course, the PPI display, the operator at the center of the screen here, making it much easier for the operator to be able to track targets, as opposed to the A scope, which was used in all other radars up to this time. So the ground controllers became expert in vectoring fighters in to within that point where AI radar could take on the target. Well, that's the radar component, but you still have to have the aircraft. And no night fighter was available, as I said, at the start of the war. And the only aircraft that was suitable conversion to this means was the Bristol Blenheim, which had been a fast light bomber, which the RAF actually tried to use at the beginning of the war as a heavy twin-engine day fighter. The Germans shot it out of the sky as a result, but it was available for night operations, and the aircraft therefore took on that role because it was big enough to fit an AI set and a radar operator. Its top speed was only, at 15,000 feet, was only 278 miles per hour. Some of the German bombers were closer to 300 miles an hour. It had an armament in a specially fitted insert into the bomb bay of 4 303 machine guns. There was also one machine gun in the wings of the Beaufighter. Not much of a wallop, but that's all Britain had as the war began. Gradually, however, a purpose-built night fighter, the Beaufighter, began to enter service in July 1940. She was an altogether different aircraft with the top speed of 320 miles per hour and a main armament of 4 20-millimeter cannons, and depending on the version, anywhere from 4 to 6 303 caliber machine guns, a massive wallop of firepower designed to bring down a bomber in a 1-second burst. The introduction of AI Mark IV, GCI, and the new Beaufighters happened nearly simultaneously at the end of 1940. And I love these shots of the Beaufighters here. Lovely shot. Almost all the shots, however, the radar antenna it's been blocked out by the sensors. You almost never see the radar. This one, I don't know if you can make it out on the screen, but right there is actually a rare shot with the Mark IV radar antenna is right there. The introduction of all these components together finally led to some successes. And as gradually the ground controllers and the pilots and the radar operators in the aircraft became accustomed to their equipment, successes began to grow. By March 1941, large numbers of German aircraft were being shot down by Mark IV equipped night fighters. From the 2nd of March until the 13th of April, AI equipped night fighters detected 189 German bombers and brought down 32 aircraft and possibly destroyed another 5. They also damaged around a dozen more. So finally, the night fighters were beginning to take their revenge on the German bombers. Gradually, as we get into the later spring of 1941, the kills increased exponentially. And this is just a table I've drawn showing you, in fact, by May 1941, with fewer raids than earlier on in the year, the night fighters brought down nearly 100 German bombers in the month of May alone. Certainly, they now had the ability to, if not thwart German night attacks, to make them so punishing that the Germans would have to think twice about unleashing more raids. However, the reality was that it all came too little and too late. AI Mark IV worked, but almost all of the successes occurred on moonlit nights because the minimum range remained around 500 feet. And moonlit nights, that was good enough, but on dark nights, you needed 250 feet. There was only one AI radar equipped with a magnetron, which allowed for centimetric wavelengths, 10 centimeters, as opposed to the AI Mark IV's 1.5 meter wavelength. When the first magnetron-equipped AI set, the Mark VIII, was introduced in December 1941, was it possible that the bombers could be shot down on the darkest of nights? It was too little, however, to stop the Blitz. Long before AI Mark VIII was introduced, the Luftwaffe had already shifted its bomber forces eastward, was preparing for Operation Barbarossa, and of course, by the time the Mark VIII was introduced, the Germans were already at the gates of Moscow. So how can we summarize this relatively unhappy story? There's no question that the Blitz was a disaster for the British people. Over 43,000 British civilians were killed. And by the way, it wasn't until well into the war that the number of military casualties exceeded the number of civilian casualties in Great Britain. The vast majority of these people that died were killed in the night raid, so after the end of September 1940. However, while we want to assess blame, I don't think we can really assess blame for the failure of the night defenses. Although clearly Robert Watson-Watt's mismanagement and Bowen's team's failure to work effectively with manufacturers were factor in delaying the introduction of AI. The truth of the matter was that the technological complexity and the time available precluded a better outcome. The fact of the matter was that it was a miracle that the day defenses were made effective just 5 short years after radar was invented. The night defenses took another year. And unfortunately for the British people, they didn't have another year to protect their cities. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. That was good. It was excellent. I'm going to pose some questions now to you from myself on behalf of RUSI, and then we'll go to audience questions. So before 1940, the Germans had quite a bit of experience in the conduct of night bombing. First, there was their extensive German night bombing campaign of London and southern Britain by Zeppelins and the Gotha winged bombers. And that occurred throughout most of the First World War. But also a few years before the Battle of Britain, there was the German night bombing of Madrid by their Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War. Now, one thing the Germans learned from bombing Madrid was that their aircrew training was deficient in both night and instrument flying, or what was called at that time blind flying. The Luftwaffe was able to relatively quickly rectify the shortfall, and by 1940, the Germans probably had the most capable air force in the world for blind flying and thus bombing by night. You focused on the technological aspects of air defense in both your presentations, part 1 and part 2. So keeping within that realm of technology, can you explain the workings of the German blind bombing technology that they use to help them hit their targets in southern England?
Well, it's somewhat a complex question, but let me first start off that I don't believe the Germans were terribly successful in the First World War. I mean, the amount of bombs they dropped, it was almost random. In the end product, I mean, the Zeppelins were virtually useless. As soon as you put anything up in the air against them, they were doomed. And the German bomber force was almost destroyed more by operational accidents because they're operating at the extreme limit of their ranges. As for the German capabilities, they were probably more capable than the RAF. Certainly the standards in RAF bomber crew being able to find a target as small as Berlin, and I say that in jest, was notorious. They couldn't find even one of the biggest cities in Europe, as they demonstrated during attacks on Berlin in the late summer of 1940. Now, the Germans may have been somewhat more effective, but let's not forget a couple of things. First of all, the ranges they were flying at were much less. And that made it much less difficult for them to find their targets. The vast majority of their raids were on London, which was the world's biggest target at the time. So again, not that hard to hit. As long as you had the first few planes set afire part of London, the bombers knew where to go. As for the story of their navigation aids, they were limited use during the war. Of course, during the famous Coventry raid in the mid-autumn of 1940, had some devastating effect. And there's the whole story of British scientist R.V. Jones and his detection of these navigational beams, and the question of whether or not the British should try to jam these beams to thwart the Germans, and eventually they were jammed after Coventry. I don't think they would have made much of a difference. And the reason is that while it did allow them to concentrate on Coventry, even that is one of the most effective raids, although it did a lot of damage. Didn't, for instance, really stop production at any of the factories they were targeting. And you may know the story that, in fact, there was more workers at work the day after the bombing than there had been in the previous 3 months, because they were so angry their homes had been destroyed. They immediately got to work, even though roofs were blowing off factories. They just dusted off the equipment and kept on going. Hardly any production was lost. So really, the effect of the night bombing was hopefully to spread terror, to force the British public to demand their government capitulate. And this was what the British or the RAF believed would happen as well later on in the war. And of course, what happened is British people got angry and furious about it. And while there was some decline in morale among some people, I don't think we can dispute the fact that people really were even more determined to see the war through because of what the Germans were doing. And unfortunately, night bombing did not live up to what the interwar advocates of bombing believed would happen. As always, they underestimated the staying power of the average member of the public.
Thanks for that. And that sort of answers the next question, but I'll pose it anyway, just in case you want to expand on it. As during the night bombing of the First World War, the British were very sensitive to the impact of the Zeppelin raids on civilian morale. And you've sort of elaborated, but just in case you have anything else you want to add, what was the impact on civilian morale in 1940 of night bombing?
Well, certainly it's more nuanced than of the glory days of everyone having a stiff upper lip. We now know that a lot of people who could afford it departed for the countryside and lived in exile in countryside hotels, which were full to capacity with these people, much to the disgust of many other people. And you'll see some of that in the great TV fictional account of the wartime detective Foyle's War. You'll see a bit of that. Actually, some of the stuff they have in there is really quite wonderful history. And the fact of the matter is, it wasn't altogether complete solidarity. And certainly people suffered tremendous hardships, particularly in the destruction of housing stock, not just in the physical casualties to people themselves, but the lack of housing and the number of houses that were destroyed had extraordinary problems for the British. But again, people on the whole were quite willing to see this through. And any thought of giving in, I think, was vanquished by what the Germans did. It had the exact opposite effect. And by the way, when the British launched their night bombing campaign, Frederick Lindemann, or Lord Cherwell, Churchill's scientific advisor, who promoted to the House of Lords to put him in his own cabinet, completely lied to the war cabinet about studies that had been done, which claimed that British morale had actually been damaged by the night raids. In fact, he took scientific reports and reversed the conclusions in order to demonstrate to the war cabinet that night bombing of Germany would be effective.
Okay, thanks for that. Air Chief Marshal Dowding seemed to be rather fixated on the idea of airborne interception radars mounted on twin-engine fighter aircraft, such as a Blenheim or a Beaufighter, etc. He seemed to be fixated on that as the only answer to German night bombing. Was he too fixated on that solution?
Not from the respect of the RAF. I mean, you have to remember as well that the artillery, the anti-aircraft artillery, was under command of the War Office, the Army. And it wasn't until later in the war they actually had a unified command that brought all the elements together. There was certainly a lot of effort to use other types of aircraft. One aircraft that had some successes was, surprisingly, the bizarre single-engine, twin-crewed, turreted fighter, the Bolton-Paul Defiant. Had a few successes along the way. Although they couldn't fit an AI radar into the Bolton-Paul Defiant. It just couldn't man it, because if you took the turret off, put the radar in, then it had no guns. There were no guns in the wing. So they certainly tried. They tried with Hurricanes. They probably lost more aircraft and maybe even more pilots and shot down by single-engine fighters in operational accidents, because flying at night with a single-engine fighter was very, very dangerous indeed. The bombers had better navigational aids, blind flying, as you call it, and blind landing aids to get them closer back to their airbase than the day fighters did. And there were a lot of casualties. And so Dowding, I think, reached for the only practical solution, a plane that was fast enough and could mount a powerful enough armament with an AI set and a two-person crew to bring down a German bomber.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, you mentioned about Air Chief Marshal Dowding being relieved of his job as Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command in November of 1940, and that there was a controversial move at the time, but it was also been controversial from an historical viewpoint. You went into the background of that. But of course, he was relieved, as you indicated, for his failure at the stopping the nighttime blitz, in spite of his brilliant success with daytime air defense. So I guess my question is, if we know what happened when he was relieved, how would the nighttime air defense of Britain have performed, or perhaps even changed, if Air Marshal Dowding had remained as Commander-in-Chief Fighter Command right into 1941?
Probably very little. The fact is, I think that Dowding, what happened really in November 1940, and I should clarify this, he lost the support of Winston Churchill.
Mm-hmm.
The other senior air marshals wanted him gone long before the battle started. In fact, Dowding was due for replacement in fighter command. He had done his term. He was due for replacement when the war started in September 1939, but it was agreed that because of the state that the air defenses were in, that he would be allowed to continue in that position. But Dowding refused to take advice. He fought constantly with other senior Air Force officers. And some of the important reforms that made the daytime defenses possible, and I outline these in my book, were really forced upon Dowding against his will. And Dowding only begrudgingly later would say, yeah, oh, I guess it was a good idea. You know, okay, all right, I accept that. But Dowding wasn't a liked man. And if you look at the rest of his career for the rest of the war, he doesn't get a lot of important appointments despite his great successes. And this is remarkable for a guy who had, as I said, won Britain's most important aerial campaign.
Okay, thanks for that. So just before we go to the audience and see if they have any questions to pose, do you have any other final comments you wish to offer regarding the failure to stop the nighttime blitz over Britain?
Only to emphasize the fact that as historians, we tend to look for blame. And I think when we start to look for blame, we ignore causes. And the fact of the matter is despite the issues that occurred with the radar development, research and development program, I think it's fair to say that it was simply a matter of time. And this is why when we talk about defense procurement or research and development prior to wars, as we're talking about right now, today, the notion that you can magically, for instance, provide a modern frigate or a modern jet aircraft or modern submarines after war is declared is ludicrous. And if you're not prepared for something prior to the start of war, it's highly unlikely you will be able to be prepared for that during a war. And the British were very, very fortunate indeed. It was an incredible accomplishment to have achieved the success of the day defenses. So I want to leave and emphasize that fact that I'm not actually blaming any specific people. But if I was going to blame anything, perhaps I can emphasize was the failure of British industry, where British industry really failed. And this really hit the Canadian Navy very badly, was in having modern development capabilities and production. So the British, for instance, they didn't do blueprints or write written specifications until after something was in production, if you can imagine. And this is why Canadian manufacturers had such huge difficulty trying to turn a British design into something that could be manufactured in Canada. And this was a failure that really hampered all British wartime industry for most of the war in almost all areas, from tanks to small arms.
Okay, I'm going to see if we've got any questions from the audience. One person here from Skip Triplett, he mentions a book which you may be familiar with, you may not be familiar with it, but for the views of several pilots, plotters, and ground crew, see Max Arthur's Last of the Few, an oral history type anthology, available in Kobo. Are you familiar with that book at all?
I am. I would though, and certainly there's some interesting little tidbits in there. I would strongly though urge, if you're interested in this, to read Barham's memoir, Night Fighter. And this is a guy that was one of, I think, the top 3 or 4 British aces of the Second World War. Extraordinary figure. He was finally shot down in 1944 and survived. And if you read his memoir, what's so amazing about it is not only to give you much of a story of the technology and how it was used, but also he is reflecting back and realizing how much he was suffering from post-traumatic stress during most of the war. And the reason he was shot down is because he should have been grounded. And he admits this. And that he actually, his judgment was impaired and he did something he should never have done. And this is from a man who had shot down more than 30 aircraft in the end, both at night and during the day. So it's a remarkable account.
Yeah, you'd mentioned him before. I think you quoted something from him in one of his in one of your slides, and I'd never heard of him before. But then it occurred to me, we really don't hear anything about the night fighters, in Britain in 1940 and 1941. it all concentrates, any accounts basically concentrate on the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, and sort of in reference to that 1969 movie, The Battle of Britain, which was extremely popular. And of course, it had all or many of the correct aircraft actually flying, both on German and the British side, Hurricanes and Spitfires and Heinkel 111s. And of course, they had re-engined ME 109s. But I think your point out of this is also that the Battle of Britain wasn't just about Spitfires and Hurricanes. That's an important aspect of the Battle of Britain, but there was more to it, as you've illustrated in the technological aspect. Okay, we've got somebody here. The Germans appear, from Paul Saguna. The Germans appear to have developed their advanced night fighter capabilities rapidly. Was there parallel research being conducted in Germany at the same time as in Great Britain?
Well, in terms of radar, absolutely. Probably German radar was technologically superior to British radar until the British introduced the cavity magnetron, something which the Germans never quite figured out until the very end of the war, which gave a quantum advantage to British radar. But Paul's question also involved German night fighters. Well, I'll point out that there weren't any German night fighters in 1940 or 41 either. And it was only really in 1943 that the Germans began to introduce relatively effective night fighters, mostly, interestingly enough, well, first of all, the failed twin-engine day fighter, the ME 110, and as well their fast bomber, the Junkers 88, were their principal night fighters. And the Germans had relatively effective ground control interception radar, and they had relatively effective airborne interception radar, and their system didn't operate too terribly different, except that often the AI radar equipped night fighters operated independently, as the British did. Because sometimes there were so many British bombers in this bomber stream, you didn't need ground control interception. They couldn't differentiate. So they would just pick a target of opportunity. And because these aircraft were equipped with massive cannon armament, some of which were angled to fire upwards into the belly of a bomber, they devastating impact on the British bombers. And the British bombers were almost incapable of defending themselves. One of the controversies that's often suppressed is the British Bomber Command refused to re-equip British bombers with heavier machine guns or even small cannon, because the 303 machine gun was totally useless. And so, yeah, the Germans had tremendous effect. If you read that memoir, I mentioned Night Fighter, you'll see the British efforts to counter the night fighter by flying their own night fighters into interceptions of German night fighters operating in the British bomber stream. And there were quite a few successes using both Beauforts and then eventually Mosquitoes. However, interestingly enough, the British wouldn't allow those night fighters to have the latest AI sets, the Mark 8, because they didn't want the Germans getting hold of these really modern sets. So they all were equipped with the older Mark 4s, the EMI Mark 4s, same set they used in the Blitz. And they used it with great effect against the bomber stream, against the night fighters.
Okay, thanks for that. Alex Greer has a question, and he says, Dr. Zimmerman mentions the failure of British industry in the development of radar. And he says, I might be generalizing, was this problem due to prevailing attitudes? And I would sort of interpret that to pride or hubris, perhaps.
No, I think actually I would interpret differently. The British manufacturing came out of very much a skilled artisan craftsperson tradition. And so it was sort of like expected that the guy on the factory floor would be able to tinker with things to get things to fit and to get things to work properly. And it was also expected that once it got into operational use, people would be able to tinker with things, make them work. The British love to tinker. You know, in the old days, I remember going to Britain back in the 70s, and the British would always be out with the cars they only drove on weekends, their Jaguars, their MGs. And the rest of the week, they were tinkering with them so they could drive them for 5 miles before they broke down. And I know this is some people probably want to say that's a terrible thing to say. But the fact of the matter is, British manufacturing standards in terms of mass production were hopeless. And this caused no unbelievable problems. For instance, in the Western Desert, the first Crusader tanks to arrive in the 8th Army, they realized that tanks were falling apart because they hadn't properly tightened all the bolts. The rivets hadn't been tightened because they hadn't used a torsion wrench to finish them off. Canadians had unbelievable problems with British equipment because Canadians, on the whole, they didn't have an understanding of how to get in and just, figure out which tube was broken and which tube you therefore had to replace. The way the Americans did it and the way the Canadians understood is take an entire subcomponent of part of the chassis, whip it out, get a new one out of stores, plunk it in. Couldn't do that with British radar. You had to find the exact specific component part to make it work. And this caused utter chaos in the Canadian Navy during the Battle of the Atlantic. And basically, Canada became an expert at re-engineering British designs so they could be manufactured in North America. And that caused all sorts of problems for the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah, and of course, the American strength was basically a lot of weapon systems, tanks, vehicles, et cetera, they built were specifically designed for mass production, as you indicated, where you could just pull off an entire transmission and replace it or whatever.
Even more so, they're scientists, whether they're university scientists or not. There was a much greater respect in the academic world for the engineer. And there was much better understanding of going to private industry, which were experts at the development and implementation of manufacturing of a new device. So the scientists at MIT would develop American radar. They would then give it to a manufacturer like General Electric, to their research people who would then turn this into a device that could be easily mass produced in factories. And that was the huge success that the Americans had, which the Canadians tried to emulate. In some areas, the Canadians were successful. Other areas, they were not.
Yeah, Leonard Jenks sort of expands on this. His question is, you have noted shortcomings in industry, which we've been discussing, but how much did political inaction contribute to the lack of preparation in Britain?
Well, it depends on what you mean by lack of preparation. If we're talking specifically about the air defenses, I believe the RAF got everything they asked for. And the fact is, it's one of the great secrets. There's a mythology amongst left-wing British historians that the British government didn't build large bomb shelters in British urban centers because they didn't care a damn about the proletariat. And I'm using their words. And the fact of the matter is the reason they didn't build huge bomb shelters was because the British spent their money and resources they had building up the actual defenses. And none of that could be discussed in public because all the technologies involved in the defenses, whether day or night, were top secret. And there's all sorts of strange things that come out of this. There's the T-shirt that has made the waves and has appeared in all sorts of manifestations about keep calm, carry on, which was a British campaign that was going to be launched if people began to panic. And, they never actually launched that campaign because there was no need, because people didn't panic. And the fact of the matter is, during the day, the RAF was incredibly effective and did stop the German attacks. Now, the nighttime issues was a completely different matter. But again, I think no one could have predicted, for instance, that the Luftwaffe would be just across the English Channel in France. And I think the notion that the British weren't prepared, at least for the air defenses, is simply not true. There were many other aspects of the war they were not prepared for, but this was not one of them.
Okay, thanks for that. I don't see any more questions, so I think we're going to wrap it up then. Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman, for an excellent detailed presentation of the lesser known technical aspects behind the Battle of Britain. And your presentation certainly, as I said before, highlights the fact that the Battle of Britain wasn't just about Spitfires and Hurricanes, as important as those factors were. There were other aspects which you've elaborated from the technical side that were also of importance. But I want to thank you also for your time and effort in putting this together for our RUSI-VI members. So thank you very much, Dave, for an excellent presentation.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I hope that the rest of your seminar series, maybe some of them live with food, will be equally as successful. It's always a great pleasure to talk to RUSI, who I have such great respect for. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So that ends our presentation today. Thank you very much.